Throughout the 1980s, the video game landscape in Japan, and indeed North America and Europe, was akin to the Wild West. Unlike today, where there are clear expectations amongst the wider video game fanbase and tried and true methods have been established for delivering on those expectations, back then, everything was still being figured out. And with the cost of producing games relatively low in comparison to what it is now, it would see publishers keen to pump out as many games as they could, all with the hopes of striking it lucky. In the West, this was focused on platforms such as the Atari 2600, the Apple II, and the ZX Spectrum. But in Japan, personal computers were the initial battleground before interest spread over to the Famicom. As a late entrant into this foray, Square were, in the initial sense at least, content with growing within their means. It would see them produce numerous text-based adventures that would each have a progressive increase in scope. But by late 1986, just 2 years after Square had released their first game, they too had fallen into the same trap as many other publishers. It saw Square deviate from the tried and tested as they attempted to strike gold on the Famicom. But as they were quite late to the party, and companies like Namco and Konami were already well-established players, the only way for Square to compete was to produce more games. And not just that, those games would need to be produced within less time, something that led to a diminishment in their quality. This approach was in full force throughout 1987, with many of the team forced to not only work themselves to the bone in order to produce games quicker, to do so within genres that didn't suit their talents. It led to a lot of frustration. And for one developer in particular, called Hironobu Sakaguchi, that frustration was reaching boiling point. Sakaguchi had joined Square at the start of their journey towards the end of 1983, initially as a clerk who was helping to manage their computer rental business. But once the shift towards video game development manifested, not only were his creative talents and aptitude for leadership quite clear, so too was his drive and commitment. On Square's first formal game, which would be named The Death Trap, this saw Sakaguchi even earn the nickname Goblin amongst his fellow co-workers due to how much of a taskmaster he was. But with Sakaguchi at the helm, the project had a clear vision, and when it went to market towards the end of 1984, even though its sales weren't all that stellar, as they had made a big mistake with regards to its price point, the game ended up generating around 30 million yen, or around $120,000 at the time. From that point on, Sakaguchi was hooked. He proceeded to oversee the creation of a sequel called Will: The Death Trap 2, taking on more responsibilities throughout its development before being installed as the director for an even more ambitious game called Cruise Chaser Blasty, which would see Square team up with a prestigious animation house called Nippon Sunrise. After that, Sakaguchi was then tasked with figuring out how to make Square successful on the Famicom, as the company had decided to shift focus away from developing games for personal computers. But this decision started to eat away at Sakaguchi, as even though he was in a leadership position, directing numerous games and being able to influence how they went to market, in reality, he had limited control over the types of games he was being asked to make. The first instance of this was a game called King's Knight, a vertical shooter. The genre had been booming, especially within the arcades, and there must have been a feeling at Square that this was a trend that they should latch onto. Using games like Nightmare as a source of inspiration, this saw Sakaguchi fuse his love for role-playing games with established elements from the genre to create a new genre called the Formation RPG. But even though this was a noble objective, Square in general had a lack of knowledge about how to develop this type of game, and beyond that, it was also their first time developing for the Famicom, so they had to work with a third-party studio called Works. When it launched, King's Knight ended up being very complex, to the point that Square even had to publish strategy guides as part of its promotional campaign to help players understand how to play the game and finish it. But they were undeterred, and Square doubled down on their decision to create games for the Famicom, even hiring a famed American programmer called Nasir to help Sakaguchi. The first collaboration would be in an adjacent genre. Unlike King's Knight, which was a top-down vertical shooter, this new game would be a third-person rail shooter, as Nasir would be able to create simulated 3D sprites. There must also have been a hope that they would be able to piggyback off of the success of games like Space Harrier and Thunder Scepter. But development was a challenge, as Nasir spoke no Japanese, and it was Sakaguchi who was given the responsibility of utilizing his talents to the maximum, something that added layers of pressure, as Nasir's talents no doubt came with quite the cost overhead. Despite this barrier, Sakaguchi worked with Hiromichi Tanaka to create ways of working that would suit Nasir. After all, they had both played Nasir's games in the past and were kind of in awe of his talents. The first game they worked on together would be known as Tobidase Daisakazen, or Operation Jumpout. It would end up being quite derivative of the aforementioned arcade games, but it was still innovative nonetheless, as it did something no other game had ever done before: feature stereoscopic 3D graphics on the Famicom disk system. Square believed that this would make Operation Jumpout a must-have game, ordering a large volume of copies and supporting LCD shutter glasses. But despite the game selling hundreds of thousands of copies, it failed to meet expectations, and Square were left with egg on their face and piles upon piles of 3D glasses, as well as countless copies of unsold games that did nothing but take up space in their warehouse and gather dust. But there was still a belief that this technology would resonate with consumers, and Sakaguchi was tasked with finding another genre that could make use of stereoscopic 3D. After some searching, the decision was made to create a driving game that would be released in Japan as Highway Star. This was another genre that had been seeing a huge level of interest amongst gamers, especially within the arcade scene. This had been driven by games like Hang On and Outrun, but the challenge faced by Sakaguchi and his now extended team was, how could they make a game that was better than Outrun and do it on the Famicom? Outside of using the stereoscopic 3D functionality, they did this by making small tweaks to both gameplay and graphical elements. It would see the creation of much more lavish environments, with the player also able to coast once the timer finished, giving them the hope that they might still be able to reach the checkpoint. All things considered, when Highway Star released, it was able to stand on its own, as opposed to being seen as an Outrun clone, but sales were again poor when compared to Square's expectations, and for Sakaguchi, this was quite damaging. Having dropped out of university to pursue the fantasy of creating video games, Sakaguchi had given his all to each of the games he was overseeing. But upon reflection, that just hadn't been enough, as even though his games had collectively sold hundreds of thousands of copies, he still felt like a failure. His dream had always been to make a smash hit, something that would be genre-defining and would really inspire the general public. But even though he released some solid games that pushed boundaries, it just hadn't been enough for them to step up to that next level. Sakaguchi had also been wrestling with internal conflicts, as despite being able to live the dream and create video games for a living, he had seldom been allowed to make the types of video games he actually wanted to make. Ever the loyal employee, this had seen Sakaguchi creating the types of games he was asked, essentially playing the hand he was given. When Highway Star was wrapping up, this led to a period of reflection, and Sakaguchi weighed up his options, which were plentiful. Part of this was because, perhaps even though he was developing video games, he felt the probability of it becoming a successful career was quite low, so even though he had stopped attending university, he hadn't stopped paying the fees. This meant he could just pick up where he left off, finish his studies, and find a more normal job. But before taking this course of action, Sakaguchi decided to give video game development one last chance. And this time, he would make the type of video game he wanted to make from the beginning, a role-playing game. Sakaguchi had been attempting to sell the idea of creating a role-playing game for some time, but there was a long-felt belief within the senior management team at Square that role-playing games just wouldn't sell on home consoles due to how slow and data-orientated they were. It led to many previous proposals being shot down, but this time, Sakaguchi had additional ammunition, as Dragon Quest had turned out to be a sleeping giant, recovering from a very slow start to sell over 2 million copies. Armed with this knowledge, Sakaguchi was able to convince the senior team that creating a role-playing game wouldn't be a financial disaster. But even though he was given the green light, there was another challenge. Due to his reputation as a taskmaster and for creating games that had underwhelming performance, nobody wanted to work on the project. According to reports, it meant that when Sakaguchi presented his vision to his peers, only 3 people volunteered to join his team. Realizing this wouldn't be enough to make a game of this nature, Sakaguchi was relentless in trying to build the team and managed to convince Koichi Ishii to join the project. It meant that Ishii worked on the initial planning while the rest of the team finished up with Highway Star, but once everyone became available, it was full steam ahead. As people started to see how the project was coming together, more and more people wanted to join. They saw how cool the game was shaping up to be, and to push it even further, Square supplemented their internal staff by outsourcing and hiring specialists in their respective fields such as Yoshitaka Amano and Kenji Terada. And by the end of the project, despite development being a huge whirlwind which involved scope changes, name changes, and even disputes around fulfillment, Final Fantasy shipped on the 17th of December 1987. And due to its now famed success, which saw it sell through its initial shipment of 400,000 copies with consummate ease, Hironobu Sakaguchi was convinced to stay at Square, something that would end up leading to the creation of an awe-inspiring legacy and some of the greatest games of all time. And on that note, we would love to hear in the comments below which game you believe to be Sakaguchi's greatest. And it would also be wonderful to hear if you enjoyed this bite-sized history format. If you did, we'll think about how we can create more videos of a similar nature in the future. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, the livestream, Galcian de Kujata, Gregory and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.